Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome in to another new episode of The Lager Line, brought to you by Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. As always, I'm your host, Ben Dubose. You can follow my work in the Rockets Wire, rocketswire.usatoday.com. That's the USA Today Sports Media Group affiliate for the Rockets. I also contribute to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of the Rockets in Houston. For today's show, I'm joined by Matt Moore of the Action Network. You may also know him as HP Basketball on Twitter, one of my favorite national NBA guys in the business. Matt, good evening. How are you?
Hanging in, man. Getting ready for a busy free agency. How are you doing?
Pretty well, gearing up for a relatively quiet free agency in Houston. We're so trained to like the Daryl Morey era that we're used to these fireworks shortly after free agency starts, if not in terms of signings, at least in terms of rumors. Seems like it'll be relatively quiet this year in Houston because, of course, everyone's gearing up for when they have cap flexibility in 2023. There are at least some moves that are going to be coming. We're going to talk about the Jae'Sean Tate situation in just a few minutes, but Matt, where I want to lead off with is the draft, because I think what happened with the Rockets last week at the draft, getting Jabari Smith, is going to be more impactful than anything they do in free agency. So I know there's a ton of unpredictability with rookie prospects, but everyone going in expected Paolo Banchero at 3. Orlando pulled the last-minute switch, so the Rockets ended up with Jabari instead. What do you think that means for the Rockets? Are you higher or lower on their rebuild based on ending up with Jabari instead of Paolo?
That's a good question. I think given the gap between the three guys, I think they're about where I expected them to be. Like, it's a good combination, I think, with Jalen Green, right? I think that's a good long-term combination of Jalen Green and Jabari. Jabari picked up a lot of steam early in the season, and then it kind of tapered off a little bit towards the end just because his finishing ability really struggled. But overall, I think you cannot say definitively, well, you can never say definitively with these draft picks, but even going in, like, from where we're at right now, like, best image right now, you can't really sit there and go like, well, Houston got the best player, or OKC got the best player, or Orlando got the best player. Those three guys were at the same level, and that became apparent more and more closer we got to the draft. That's why Paolo Banchero wound up jumping from number 3 to number 1. And while, Houston was obviously excited for Banchero and ready to take him, I think much of that was because they were like, oh, okay, it's these two guys, and then we're going to get Banchero, and Banchero's great. And that's awesome. They're all three on the same tier. They were always on the same tier. And if you talk to anybody that is really smart about the draft, they always had those three guys on a tier to themselves. A few guys had one guy lower, whether it was Jabari or Paolo. Most people didn't have Chet any lower. So I think in the end, you wind up getting a good fit a good piece that you can fit around. I don't know that Jabari is going to be a superstar. It's possible because these things are always unstable and he did go very high. I don't think he's going to be a megastar, but I think that you do have the foundation of something to start building towards. And there's a good chance that either Jalen Green or Jabari Smith are going to wind up being stars. And that gives you a foundational starting point to start building a championship roster.
The other part that sold me on it is that I think Jabari is a cleaner fit with some of the guys they have on the current roster. Given the investment costs, I don't think you're expecting Alperen Sengun or Kevin Porter Jr. to become a star, but certainly they are lottery tickets to an extent. And I think Jabari having a cleaner fit with them than Paolo would have conceivably been when you think about the ball handling and the touches required. Maybe that gives you a better chance of hitting on KPJ or Sengun. Of course, the Rockets have another opportunity to have a high pick in 2023 because I don't know who they're conceivably going to pass other than a small handful of teams potentially if everything goes right. Bottom line, no matter what, the Rockets are going to pick high in the draft next year. They control their own pick. So there's other ways that even if Jabari isn't that star, maybe you get lucky and KPJ or Sengun hit. Maybe you get a guy high in 2023. But I think Jabari just gives you more options when filling out your roster. And that's sort of how I've come around on it because of the versatility. In fact, he doesn't need a ton of touches, the defense, the shooting. is he easier to build around than a lot of prospects just based on the fact that he's, can be used a lot of different ways and has a pretty diverse skill set?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, you got a 6'10" elite shooter. That's like that's a pretty good place to start, right? Like that's a great place to start off your program with. I think the Şengün question, I think, is a really interesting one based off of the fact that his numbers were so good in a vacuum per 36, but didn't get the minutes, and then was a little bit inconsistent as the year went on. I think some of that was rookie wall and where the Rockets were at in terms of playing for positioning. So you're right that there's kind of this lottery aspect where these other guys that can kind of get there, and everyone can have their own opinions. I have my own opinions on Kevin Porter and Jalen and Şengün and all these guys, but having more chances at one of those guys developing, which can fundamentally change it. Like if you can have these opinions, but to be honest with you, when you're dealing with players this raw, you just don't know. The uncertainty is there. Did the Rockets draft like a guaranteed, like, this is our guy for the next 10 years? No, but I also don't think that guy was in this draft. I don't think the Magic can say, like, we drafted our guy for the next 10 years. I don't think the Oklahoma City Thunder can say they drafted their guy for the next 10 years. I really don't. And I don't even know if Detroit with Jaden Ivey or any of these other guys, I don't think that any of these players in this draft were of that level. And like you mentioned, Houston's likely to be in good position to get another high lottery pick next year. And obviously there's one name at the top of that list, which is Victor, but there will be other guys that will go pretty high. That draft is highly touted. So, keeping a long-term view, not trying to rush it. And in the short term, you do, I think, want to start building the right habits as you rebuild the culture and refit the organization after the Harden era. And as you do that, I do think it's important to have as many pieces that can go together so you have less tension. I think there's still probably decisions that Houston's going to have to make in the medium term about this, but I do think that there's a good chance that this roster fits together better, at least on paper, than maybe last year's did.
And the reason I bring up the short-term scenario, I'm fascinated by what's going to go on in terms of evaluating Stephen Silas next season, because clearly the last 2 years are not his fault. The circumstances of the Rockets' job changed dramatically from when he took that gig in late 2020. Everything fell out from under him, and he had nothing to do with that. With that said, he signed a standard 4-year contract, and you know how this typically works, Matt, in the NBA. Teams make decisions on you after year 3 because there are very few lame ducks. Mike D'Antoni a few years ago was the exception. I think the Rockets learned from that experience. They don't want to do that again. So the bottom line is most of these first-time head coaches, they're judged after the 3rd season. Do you want to go to a second contract with this guy? And yet, with as young as the Rockets are going to be, it's not really reasonable to expect a ton more wins from Stephen Silas and the Rockets next season. So if you're Rafael Stone, if you're Patrick Fertitta, if you're Eli Wittes, the rest of the front office, how are you evaluating Stephen next season when you can't reasonably expect that many more wins? What do you want to see from them to convince you that Stephen is the guy?
I want to see discipline, and not in terms of like yelling at people. I want to see on-court discipline. I want to see that the message is getting through and playing smart. I need to go back and do like a really significant deep dive on Houston. Houston was, to be honest with you, it was a bear to watch at times as the season got on. And a lot of that was not about the talent. Like everyone just kind of goes like the talent. For me, it's more about, and a lot of this is to be expected. If you're a rebuilding team, you have inexperienced players and you have borderline fringe players that you're exploring whether or not they can play. And there were guys I really liked. Like I think Tate was great. I loved everything I saw from Tate. The backcourt was a lot for me to kind of sit through and deal with because they made the kind of decisions that drive me insane in terms of their shot decisions and things like that. I think Jalen improved as the year went on. So to me, it's about, can you kind of get this team to run an offense with discipline? Can you value possessions? Can you be like, okay, now we're going to try and get, this mechanism. We're going to work through multiple options. We're not just going to take the first thing in front of us. Can you play with a little bit more discipline offensively? I don't expect much on the defensive end. The roster's young and undersized and has a lot of these types of issues. But I think the intensity was there for Houston, but the discipline and focus to value possessions really wasn't. And that's something that I definitely want to see this year. If you see that from Houston, along with like, okay, if you're able to look at the end of the year and you go, you know what, Jalen took a big step forward. Like he really showed that he is a much more versatile guard than he was at the start of the year. The game slowed down for him. We saw, Green Jabari Smith had a great rookie season. Doesn't have to win Rookie of the Year. Just he showed all the things that we want him to see. He was an impact maker in all these areas, and he looks comfortable and like he knows how he fits, and he got touches. If Alperen Şengün gets the minutes that he deserves and is able to grow in those respects, I think you can walk away from it. But for me, I think this is one of the most challenging parts of these jobs, is why coaches don't love these types of gigs, is he's got to be able to get a young team to buy in, to put their own, not only their own agendas, but their impulses aside and commit to how you want to run the team. I didn't see enough of that. I honestly don't know what kind of team he wanted. And that to me is like a warning sign. That's what I would really want to see by the end of next season.
The case for upside offensively, I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier, is that by sliding in Jabari, who's going to help you with floor spacing immediately and length, then it gives you some upside with KPJ and Şengün. Maybe one of those guys takes a step forward next year. You're going to have more usage to go around because you're not going to have Christian Wood taking up possessions to the extent that he did at times next year. So maybe one of those young guys takes a step forward. Silas has talked a lot about defense during the offseason, and that's sort of interesting to me because, as you said, when you're this young, it's hard to expect very much, at least at a team level, defensively. Then again, you look at the last 2 years, you have seen some young guys enter the league and make a quick impact defensively. You look at Jae'Sean Tate with the Rockets 2 years ago. You look at Herb Jones with the Pelicans this past year. And these top two picks, Jabari Smith and then Tari Eason out of LSU, do have a strong, at least individual reputation on the defensive end. Is there anything to the idea that if you end up hitting like a Tate or a Herb Jones, that maybe you can be not dramatically improved on defense, but maybe 25th instead of 30th? Or is that just too much to ask when the team is just this extraordinarily young?
No, I think you can aim for 25th to 20 to 25th. Like that's actually a really good level of expectation. Like that's a great point by you in terms of, it's okay. You don't have to expect like we're not going to be 15, and don't get caught in we're going to play the guys that are going to get us to 15. Don't do that. You don't want to do that. You are definitely right. Rebuilding, right? But try and get yourself to where you're like, hey, they started off the year 28th in defense in November, and by the time that March came around, they were 24th. That sounds like a small difference. It's significant. The gap between like 22nd, 24th in this league defensively and 29 to 30th is pretty significant. Like that is a major tier jump as far as like how I look at the league. It's like there's basically 18, maybe 17 to 23-ish, and then there's like 24, 25, and then there's like 28, 27 and beyond that, you are just helpless and hopeless, and you are at the very, very bottom. That gap between those is actually, I think, more significant than maybe the gap between 17 and 15 or even 14. Like those teams are usually in the same kind of range. And so being able to make that kind of a jump, not to something crazy, but if you can do it, especially with the young guys, even if that means relying on, it's okay to say we're going to rely on one veteran, depending on who that is, whether it's like, hey, we're just going to like roll out Boban for like 15 minutes a game and do that kind of thing. Or, if you're like, hey, we're going to play these veterans that we have on roster, depending on who they've got by the end of it, whether it's, Dennis Schroeder or whoever, you can do that, I think, in limited minutes, just to be like, hey, this unit, the defense actually isn't that bad. And that provides you kind of like a few minutes where the defense kind of makes sense, and you can teach guys in those units kind of how to play. Having realistic expectations, I think, is good. But the difference is like setting them pretty hard. It's like, hey, if we don't get to 25th in defense, this has been a failure on us this season. That, I think, is kind of the priority. Is you should set some sort of expectation for, look, if you guys are just going through the motions, like we failed as a team, and this is really where we want to get to by the end of the season.
Yeah, and 100% they do have better tools with Smith and Easton. That's the thing. They are definitely longer. They are definitely more athletic. There's a lot more for Stephen Silas to work with on that end of the floor. And so that's why, it's tricky. It's nuanced. You don't want to set the bar too high, but at the same time, just because they're young doesn't mean you can't see some improvement, because there is something to work with. And that's one of those things that I do think is going to go into the whole calculus of how Stephen is evaluated at the end of the year. Matt, I want to flip the page to free agency. You wrote a big column for the Action Network today previewing it. You did not mention the Rockets a single time, which I understand why. The Rockets are not exactly relevant on a national scale these days. And secondly, because of the whole cap space in 2023, no one really expects them to be that active in this free agency period, because you're going to try and retain at least a lot of that space for next summer. They're rebuilding now and not really trying to make the big leap forward, trying to get one more high draft pick next season and then make the leap forward the coming year, which is 2024, which is when those draft pick obligations to OKC come back into play. Matt, I'll start you with this. Because you're writing about the Rockets and tweeting about them a little bit less these days because they're less nationally relevant, I think we all understand that. How much do you miss fighting with Rockets fans on Twitter?
Very little, because if I mention them in any regard, I still get them popping into my mentions like constantly. We're still fighting about the same things 5 years later.
The Harden-Giannis MVP debate?
Yeah, more Giannis MVP debate and about Harden and all these types of things. And honestly, I admire the passion for still defending Harden to this day after everything. Like, I have a lot of respect for folks for being still defensive of James after he bailed. Like, that's that level of like, you know what? It was unfortunate. It sucked, but hey, I still love the guy. I rooted for him so hard. I want good things for him. I appreciate that. I think, look, I will say this. I try and avoid certain topics where it's like, okay, I don't want to start things, so I'm just not going to mention this. Because again, like I kind of mentioned, there's a lot of things with the backcourt that I'm just like, I want to be like, why? Are they this way? But Rockets fans are going to be pretty defensive. And I think we've seen that with the whole Jalen Green conversation. I want to be very clear. Like, I am at this point in time, I'm willing to say, like, I need to do more research on Jalen's season. Mm-hmm. Like, I was very plugged in on Houston for like that first 3 months. And then like as the season goes on, and people have talked about this, like Zach Lowe's talked about this, there's teams that you just pay attention to less because your attention is divided elsewhere. And Houston, I think, was definitely one of those situations. Like, I did some NBA League Pass broadcast of Rockets games, so I still had some opportunities to watch them. And again, like, I just gotta say, like, Jae'Sean Tate is like one of my favorite guys in the league right now. And so, depending on assuming he returns, like, that's a big reason for me to watch next season. I'm excited for this next season. I'm always excited to watch all these teams next season.
But basically, you weren't as dialed in when Jalen made his leap late in the year.
Yeah, that's a lot of it, honestly, and that's why I will say this: like, when Rockets fans are adamant, I will give them this on top of it. Like, I'm again not anti-Rockets fans. Usually, I find annoyingly they're usually right. Like, oftentimes when I get these, I'll put out a criticism and I'll get huge pushback, and I'll be like, okay, well, I'll go do the research and I'll show you, and then I'll do the research and be like, damn it, they're right. Like, it's really annoying, but it's true. And so Jalen, I think, is a good example of, like, I'm not going to sit here and make declarative statements about Jalen and where he's at now, when that's what I do over the next month, is I go back and I really do watch all these teams that were at the bottom, to be like, I did not pay as much attention to them then because I was paying attention to the teams that were in contention, trying to figure out the title picture or the playoff picture. Now is the time when it's like, all right, let's see what they got. Let's see how this operated. Let's go back and watch this. I'm excited to see, what there is to learn about Jalen's late season push.
Yeah, the 3 games, by the way, I would recommend you watching. I think they might have been in a row. If they weren't, they were in very close succession in early March. Memphis, the Lakers, and Utah. They won 2 of those games. They beat Memphis and the Lakers. They lost to Utah in overtime, but that was a stretch in which you could really see the light bulb starting to come on, and all of those games were competitive late in the fourth quarter and overtime, so you had some high leverage possessions. And for me, that was when you could really see, again, I go back to this cliche, but the light bulb coming on. Everybody talks about that 30-point stretch towards the end of the year, but some of that was, they shut down all the veterans, Christian Wood, Eric Gordon. There were a lot of touches to go around, and you know how NBA teams are when they're playing out the string. Sometimes the intensity was not there. But that stretch in early March, Grizzlies, Lakers, and Utah, those are 3 at least capable teams. I know the Lakers are what they are, but certainly the talent when LeBron is out there is something. And he played really well in all of those games and led the Rockets to wins, and 2 of them took the Jazz to overtime. So I think that's where I would recommend you starting. As far as free agency, the situation with Jae'Sean Tate is interesting. Everyone until today expected the Rockets to just use the last year of his rookie contract, which was really cheap, under $2 million for his production. As you mentioned, very valuable player defensively with intangibles, all those types of things. And Oklahoma City made a similar decision with Lou Dort, turning down his last year very cheap to make them restricted free agents this summer. Now it's already come out that the Rockets plan to re-sign Jae'Sean Tate, and of course he's going to be restricted, and the Arenas rule applies, which means he can't get any offers no matter what higher than the non-taxpayer mid-level. So the bottom line, the Rockets are going to get Jae'Sean a deal a year early, and it might eat into their cap room next summer a little bit, but at the same time, over the whole value of the contract, the average annual value is probably going to be a little bit less, a deal that's a little bit friendlier to the team. Also, you give Tate the bonus of getting him his first really big NBA contract a year early, so maybe there's some positive vibes that come from that, your relationship with the player. Rockets want to be seen as player friendly these days. What do you think of that trend, what the Rockets did with Tate and the Thunder did with Lou Dort, because clearly they want to keep him as well from everything that I can tell. Is that just a 1 year sort of outlier because not that many teams have cap space in 2022, or if that's something that you might see more of, teams, not taking the final year of that super cheap initial deal and then trying to leverage that to get the second contract done early?
Yeah, I think a lot of this gets into if you can get guys on multi-year deals on these smaller contracts, a lot of it is that those multi-year deals are more attractive in trade talks. So it kind of increases the asset and it helps both sides, right? You get more financial security for the player, and on your side, you get more of a secured asset to be able to move that you don't have to address again and again and again. It helps you against these kind of jumps that you're expecting. A lot of this does depend on the trust between the player, their agent, and the team. That is like a key here. And I will say, like, there's always an inherent risk here with if you open them up to free agency, there is a risk that somebody gets in the door and makes them an offer that they simply can't turn down. So like there's always the risk there. But most often these are handshake deals agreed upon in time. Right. The player's happy there. There's not enough of a market. And, usually there is like a handshake agreement that both sides want to respect there.
Yeah, and the other part of it too, I feel comfortable in saying the relationship between Tate and the Rockets front office is very good. They actually made it a point last season to pick up his second-year option early to guarantee it because they could have taken it all the way down to the deadline, but they really liked the leadership example that he did, especially a year ago, because that 2020 to 2021 season when Harden left and it was just a disaster zone in his wake, Tate really had a really key role in sort of bringing that locker room together, and they wanted to reward him. And so I feel pretty confident in saying the relationship is strong there, and that's certainly part of the thinking, and it's evolved a bit for the Rockets in recent years, especially the Rafael Stone administration. We've seen also with John Wall this week letting him out of his contract, doing the buyout before free agency, so he gets to choose his next destination. I've heard from a few people around the league that Rafael Stone has a pretty good relationship with Rich Paul and Clutch Sports, which can be important. And this certainly should help that rather than hold Wall hostage, hoping that maybe you get a second round pick from the Lakers or something like that. Let him out early, let him choose his next destination. And it's interesting to me because the Rockets during the Daryl Morey years were known as looking at players as assets. That was a criticism that you heard all the time on Twitter and even from some in the agent community, that the Rockets don't value the human factors enough. And some of it, I think Daryl gets an unfair rap on that because he was trying to contend. You have to do things differently when you're trying to contend, as opposed to, Rafael right now is in the early stages of a rebuild. So you can gamble a little bit more on the human factors. You're not as cutthroat in your evaluations as when you've got James Harden in his late 20s, early 30s, and you're trying to put a contender on the floor. It's a little bit different. And Daryl never got a chance to rebuild. Well, he wanted to in the early 2010s, but then owner Les Alexander did not let him do it. So we never saw Daryl in a rebuild. So it's comparing Daryl in contention mode to Rafael Stone in a rebuild is somewhat apples to oranges. With that said, the Rockets now under Stone are clearly putting priority on building these positive relationships with players and especially their agents around the league in hopes that, maybe you do something for Rich Paul and Clutch Sports now and something positive happens when you do have that cap space in 2023 and you're looking for guys to spend it on. How important do you think that is or isn't, what they're trying to do, sort of rebuilding their rep and making the Rockets seem a bit more player friendly to players and especially agents around the league?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done on that, just based off of Daryl had so much support from the front, from ownership under Les, that I think he had a lot more freedom. And honestly, he had a track record. He had a proven track record of success to be able to take the approach that he did, which was, he wielded power and still continues to. Like, he wields power very effectively, both over in negotiations and things like that. Like, he sets the tone of, hey, we got a number. We're not going above that number. Or, hey, we're going to do this. Like,
right.
No guarantees given, those types of approaches. And there are costs. Like, there are measures there where it causes player discontent and it can impact things. And so I think as you're trying to change those cultures, it's interesting to me, several executives have always said that team culture will always take on the identity of their best player. But I think when you're in a rebuilding mode, you don't have that yet. Like the young players aren't able to exert themselves that way yet. They haven't grown into that yet. So the front office oftentimes has to take those kinds of roles, and they have to really build that culture. And I think a lot of that honestly comes from coaching. I think that coaching winds up being like a huge impact on that factor. As far as I think rebuilding those relationships, I do think that there's something to be done there. I think there's like part of it is I do think there's value, especially in this day and age, of you got to bend over backwards. You just do. Like you just you've got to be willing to put yourself forward as very player friendly, because so many teams have proven that they are willing to go that however far they have to in order to get players and the representatives on their side.
Mm-hmm. As far as free agents that they could conceivably go after this year, it's interesting. The only position that they've reported that they're reportedly in the market for is center, because even though you're going to start Şengün now that Christian Wood is out, the bottom line is you can't really trust him to play 35 minutes per game. He averaged 5.2 fouls per 36 last year, and that was going up against backups. Now you're going to be putting them up against starters, and I think the Rockets would be pleased if you can get him in the upper 20s minutes per game. Certainly not someone that you're just going to say Alperen Şengün 100% is going to play 35 plus minutes, even if you would like him to. That's an unrealistic expectation at this stage, which is why they're trying to supplement him with a veteran center or maybe a young center. We have heard, Kelly Iko reported today that maybe they're looking into the Mo Bamba, Isaiah Hartenstein reunion, perhaps, that tier, which would require something closer to the full mid-level. Whereas I had Michael Scotto on this podcast a few days ago. He talked about some of the more veteran options that could be bargain basement, fully preserve your cap robe. Somebody like a Robin Lopez, a JaVale McGee, someone in that tier. Jonathan Fagan of the Chronicle just put out an article a few minutes ago. He seems to be closer to Michael Scotto in terms of expecting someone a little bit lower on the totem pole and not so much a young up-and-comer like Bamba and Hartenstein, in large part because of the cost, also because, Şengün's going to be the priority, and those young guys may want to go somewhere that they have a better shot at being the priority. But I guess the question I want to ask you, Matt, as far as just the cost of this, the Rockets are set up now, even if they end up, let's say, giving Jae'Sean Tate a deal at $9-10 million a year, something like that, they're still going to be in position to have upwards of $60 million in cap flexibility next offseason. How comfortable, if you're the Rockets, would you be in giving out, say, the full mid-level or something close to it this year for a guy like Bamba or Hartenstein, someone in that tier? Or would you draw a hard line and just say, you know what, I need to preserve that cap room for 2023?
I would say there's probably some value in signing a guy like Hartenstein, or honestly, your target needs to be guys that are going to be wanted at the deadline. Like that's the target.
So you sign them to try and flip them, basically. Try and sign them for positive trade value.
Right. Like the Pistons didn't wind up moving him, but the Pistons signed Kelly Olynyk for just that purpose. Like they moved that purpose for that. Yeah. So I think that's a good reason to sign a guy, is it opens up your trade talks and gives you more options. The other thing I would say is you don't want to, I would keep it generally open for the biggest reason, which is you want to be able to absorb contracts for assets. Yes. That's the best use if you're in this spot. It really is. Like, don't get settled on like, we could sign so-and-so in 20. Don't do that. No, you're not there yet. You're not there. What you can do is you can do what Detroit's done, which is you can be like, yeah, sure. No, yeah, we'll take the contract. We'll take that player, but we want 2 seconds, or we want first. Like whatever, however desperate they are to get a deal done, you become that facilitator. That's the best use of assets if you're in the situation like the Rockets.
Yeah.
Use that exception and then work around the rest of the cap room with the target. And you can use it now. You can use it at the deadline. You can use it next summer. But be the team that is willing to facilitate those types of moves. Don't allocate resources for free agency signings. Everything needs to be built with the idea of what can we get, how can we get more later, whether it's young prospects or picks. You don't always need picks. That's not always what it is, but it's, okay, we'll do this deal, but this young player that you're not using that needs a home, we would want to take a risk on him. Identify those guys and try and maneuver yourself into those types of positions. That's the best way for a team to leverage that cap space.
Yeah. The analogy that I've used is with Miami and Duncan Robinson. If you don't get any of the big guys in 2023, and they might not, as you said, they're going to be extremely young, then you trade for, hypothetically, Duncan Robinson, and you get, a first-round asset or two as sweetener to take that contract on, and then you're keeping your war chest full for when, the next guys does what James Harden did in early 2021 and says the situation is crazy. You've got the war chest ready to go down the line. And who knows, Duncan Robinson at that point may be an asset for you as like an expiring contract to help match by the time you actually are ready to make that trade. And then the other thing too is that a lot of these guys, to go with the Duncan Robinson example, a lot of these guys, people struggle to separate the contract from the player. Duncan Robinson might be overpaid, but he's still potentially a useful player for you in a season in which you're trying to get better a year from now. So again, I'm not necessarily advocating for the Rockets taking that path. There's a year from now. There's so many different things that can happen. But is that the kind of scenario that you're talking about, rather than make the big swing in 2023, take on the contract for assets and then just roll it forward?
Yeah, right. So the goal here needs to be you have to have a long-term vision. You have to really be, and that's what's hard about rebuilds. But the best way to really approach it is to be like, you're not targeting 2 years down the line. The Grizzlies have had a really exceptional rebuild in that they were like ready to go second, third year. Like they were already good Ja's rookie season. And that was pretty wild, honestly. And maybe, Jabari is a level of player that puts you at that. And at that point, you can accelerate. But the goal really needs to be, even then, there's a reason that Memphis was so patient with their assets. That's why they swapped JV for Steven Adams and also got Zaire Williams. Like they're constantly looking to add more and more assets, and they've been very patient before going all in, even though everyone's like, you should make a trade for a star. And it's like, you got to be patient. You have to time this right. It's why Denver didn't do it until Aaron Gordon. They didn't consolidate assets until Aaron Gordon was the piece that they kind of identified as like, that's a guy that can get us there. You take your time, you plot out 4 or 5 years. Like you look at it, the Denver Nuggets started rebuilding in earnest in 2016. They didn't make the playoffs until 2019. They didn't make the Western Conference Finals until 2020. And now they've taken 2 steps backwards those last couple of years because of injuries. So you have to plan. Like it's been 6 years since they started that rebuild. You plan, I think, for 4 years out to be in that position. And what you do is in these next couple of years, you bring on contracts first that can get you assets, and then later that you can then use to package together to make those moves that you want. You take on a contract where you're like, all right, this guy's on a 3-year deal. So at the deadline 2 years in, he'll have another year left on his contract, and we can move him for the pieces that we want to add in. You have to have a very long-term strategic planning and not be like, build the best team possible now, because that only is going to wind up digging you a deeper hole later.
Last question. When we talk about the timing of all of this and their return to relevancy, ESPN's Tim McMahon had a really interesting feature on the Rockets that came out on draft day, talked to pretty much every decision maker in the organization, also talked to Jalen Green, Eric Gordon, all sorts of perspectives. But the quote that resonated with me the most was something from Patrick Fertitta, who basically from an ownership standpoint is the most heavily involved on the Rocket side, because Tillman is not really a guy that's very hands-on. He's dealing with his other businesses. So Patrick is basically the ownership rep. And he talked about the Rockets having a higher pain tolerance than a lot of other franchises. And what he means by that is the willingness to bottom out. And we'll see if it works out. That's what, again, Les Alexander did not let them do 10 years ago. So we'll see what comes of this. But in terms of them bottoming out now, they are bottoming out at a time in which almost no one else is, especially in the West, other than OKC. Even the teams that, you look back 5 years ago when the Rockets were contending, you could count on the Kings, certainly. And of course, the Kings are still the Kings, but they're trying to win now. They made the Sabonis trade. You can count on the Suns being bad every year. Memphis, a lot of years after, the end of the grit and grind, there were 3 or 4, especially the small market teams, Minnesota, except for a small stretch, that you felt pretty good were going to be towards the bottom of the West every single year. And so when things started moving, if you were a bottom feeder, when things started going right for you, it was easy to go up the standings. Whereas the Rockets, they're more willing to bottom out, and maybe that benefits them in a time in which, especially in the West, not many other teams are willing to do it. But then in terms of climbing back to relevancy, there's just so much parity because everyone is trying to win. And it's like there's not really any super teams anymore, but there's a way fatter middle class in the NBA than there was 5 years ago. I don't know how sustainable that is. I don't know if maybe 2-3 years from now, you start to see a little bit less parity as some of this, new class starts getting to the age in which they can force trades, leave as free agents, a lot of uncertainty. But I guess, does it materially change your impact if you're rebuilding and you're a team like the Rockets and your timeline, that the middle class is so much fatter now than it was 5 years ago? Does that change things?
That's a great question, Ben. That's a really great question. I think it depends on like where you're at again, your development. So the reason I say that is if you're in the Rockets position, I think you're very much like, look, if we had a really special year, could we make it into the 9-10 play-in? Probably. What does that serve us?
Mm-hmm.
Are we able to then make a jump from 9-10 into the 4 seed with what we have now? Probably, like today, probably not. You may feel differently in a year, right? In a year, you may be like, no, Jabari's that dude, or Jalen's that dude. You may look at it and go, no, we have a legit superstar, and that's the biggest thing you got to do. And from there, you can kind of be like, all right, if we play our cards right, we can make the play in, and then we kind of bounce off of that and wind up, parlaying that into the playoffs, and then we build towards a championship. This thing is super complicated because I see too often teams try and convince themselves like we're closer than we are. You have to have a really cold-blooded view of, you know what? And honestly, I'll say even more than cold-blooded, you need to be skeptical. You need to look at your own team and kind of have were we that good, or did things break right for us? Was it this team tanked and this team tanked and this team tanked, and that's how we got here, right? Like if you're the Pelicans and you look at your situation and you're like, hey, we made the playoffs, like we're right there. You have Zion coming back, so that changes your equation. But let's say the Zion wasn't a factor. I would argue, like, look, the Spurs clearly were not all that interested in making the play-in enough to like pursue win now moves. They traded Derek White. You had the rest of the bottom of the West really struggling towards the end of that year. Like the Kings were the only team really trying to make it, and they're the Kings. So it's one of those where if you're in a position to buoy off of that, that's good. But I think being like, let's get into the play-in and then we can see. That's dangerous. You have to be able to plan beyond that. You have to be able to say, like, even if we don't make the play-in this year, we're going to be well set up to go beyond that into, the years after. We'll be a solid playoff team. Having those kind of perspectives, I think, is big. There are always teams that will underperform, and there's always teams that will overperform. And what you have to be able to balance out is making sure that your performance doesn't fool you into thinking that you're better, or honestly worse. I've seen teams do this where they act like they're worse off than they are, rather than taking advantage of opportunities. Balancing all that out and understanding where you are in your growth and projecting out is the hardest part, I think, about it, but it's also the most important.
One more question, and this is much more micro than macro, so we can make this relatively quick. I meant to ask you about Eric Gordon, who's not a free agent, but is certainly someone who is available during this period of, first week of free agency, pretty active, both not just in free agents, but trades, because a lot of teams that don't get their free agents or even are evaluating free agents, they're also sort of looking at that compared to guys they could get on the trade market. Windhorst has reported the Suns and Sixers potentially being suitors for Eric, and certainly the Sixers make a lot of sense. Harden's there, Morey's there, PJ Tucker may soon be there, so there's a lot of dots you can draw there. Yet the Rockets clearly value Gordon a lot differently than Christian Wood and John Wall. With Wood and Wall, it was pretty clear that they felt like that the touches those guys were taking were not conducive to the development of guys like Alperen Şengün and Kevin Porter Jr. And in Wall's case, they had to buy him out. In Wood's case, they took the first round pick that they could get to move on from those guys because they see them as not really being conducive to their on-court development. Even if they in Wall's case, they did like him off the court, just on court, the fit wasn't there. With Gordon, who doesn't really take a ton of touches, he can shoot out to 28, 30 feet, plays good defense. It's clearly different. They clearly like having him on the court with those younger guys, and they think that, Matt, one of the things that I looked up last year, the most fascinating stat to me about Houston's season. So they started 1-16 with Wood and Tice, which was, the floor spacing was just a disaster. I suspect they had the Tice deal lined up before they drafted Şengün. And if you take out that 1-16 start, the last 65 games, when they actually had proper spacing, ran a functional offense, they were actually 18-23 when Eric Gordon played, or 18-25, excuse me, which is like a 35-win pace. That's fringe play-in. When he didn't play, they were 1-22. And that goes to the value I think the Rockets see in Gordon, and that's why, he's been on the market for a while. They have had first-round offers, yet they don't want just a random late first-round pick. They want something of quality, preferably a future year. So I guess my question for you, is there value in keeping a guy like Eric Gordon? Clearly the Rockets think that there is. I think they are willing to move him for the right deal. To this point, it hasn't presented itself. But do you see that when you have a team that's in the rebuild that the Rockets currently are in, the depths that they currently are, does a guy like Eric Gordon potentially have value for developing those young guys? We can talk about wins and losses, but everybody listening is going to say, who the hell cares? The Rockets are bad. Does a guy like Eric Gordon potentially help the development of the young guys like Jalen, like Jabari, like KPJ, like Şengün? Can a guy like that materially make a difference in your experience?
It can. I think the key here is you have to manage what, honestly, and this sounds weird, but you have to manage what Gordon wants, right? As long as Eric Gordon's like, look, man, I'm getting paid a lot. I'm happy. I'm comfortable here. It's fine. If Gordon reaches a point where he's like, I really want to go try and win a championship before I'm done, because he's 33, right? Like clock's ticking.
Right.
Not everybody's going to play till 40 like Chris Paul and LeBron. So from that perspective, especially with his injury history, if he comes to the front office and is like, I think it's time for me to head on out, then I think you have to facilitate that, right? And you can, then you probably go, okay, the value of keeping Gordon, his representation, the players that Gordon knows, happy and having a good reputation as somebody that takes care of these guys is probably worth lowering our price tag for him. But until that happens, look, he was minus 5.9 in net rating last year, which is really good for a team in Houston's position. Like that's really good for a team in Houston's position. When you look at like Daniel House being minus 3.9 and Garrison Matthews and how great he was being only minus 5.6. This is pre-All-Star. So like there was value there, I think, in terms of his on-court production. But the better way to look at it is, again, kind of to compare this with Denver, who completed a pretty good rebuild. And you can do this with Memphis as well. DJ Augustin was the point guard in Denver, and Jamal Murray had to take that spot from him. And they only really moved DJ Augustin because they were like, Jamal hasn't progressed to a point where he's going to get the minutes over. You can't justify giving Murray minutes over Augustin, or not Augustin, but I'm talking about Jameer Nelson, excuse me. Jameer Nelson. We can't give him the minutes over Jameer Nelson. So we're going to move Jameer so that we have to play Jamal because that's where we're at. That's not happening now because Gordon's still coming off the bench usually and is, fine to do so. And that veteran presence as a mentor, I think, is really huge for teaching them the things that I was talking about earlier with, hey, let's not just run up and throw up a transition three every time.
Right.
Hey, let's actually try and get into the offense. Hey, time to score. Let's pay attention to those things. That's really valuable for a guy to have. Like he brings that a real value in that. Like having those voices is important. You need the vets. You just do. When you have nothing but young guys, it's too chaotic. It's too undisciplined. And if you're going to instill those habits, you need guys like Gordon to do so. But again, I think the question just comes, unless, if you get an offer that's above your asking price, you take that off. You take it up. You just go ahead and go, no, this is what's best for the organization. We'll figure out the vet stuff later. Or Gordon comes to you and says, hey, it's time for me to move on. I used to believe like, why are you just letting this asset expire? Like, don't you want to, because there's always this thirst to make the move. To get something of value. But instead, it's like, look, you got to think about what's best for your locker room. You got to think about what's best for the on-court discipline. You got to think about what's best for your coach. Having guys that are not going to make your coach lose his mind has real value. That helps the overall tone and vibe of the team. And those are things that you don't pick up unless you're one of the beat writers like Kelly or Jonathan or the guys that cover the beat every day.
Yep, exactly. Great insight there from Matt Moore of the Action Network. You can read his work, again, Action Network, or you can follow him on Twitter at HP Basketball, where hopefully the coming season he'll have a bit more to say about the Rockets. Actually, Matt, look forward to seeing the next couple of months. Once you watch the Jalen surge early in the year, I hope you do something on that because I think you'll be entertained. It was, if nothing else, extremely entertaining. So please keep us posted when you finally hit the Jalen tapes.
I will definitely be back on and give you the full review of how amazing he looks and how excited I am for his 2023 campaign.
Yeah, we'll appreciate it. Matt, thanks so much. For Matt, I'm Ben. You can follow me on Twitter at Ben Dubose, and of course, the Rockets Wire on Twitter at the Rockets Wire. That'll do it for this episode of The Lager Line, as always, sponsored by Clutch the Lager of Carbach Brewing. Again, thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode. Happy free agency, guys.